is Moses
Could
more
go either
divine?
way. Yeah.
But then it's like, well, Moses had a special birth announced and all that, and Moses is clearly human, but he's a peg above the rest of us. That's one of those things where it's so how we label these things and how we categorize these elements is really subjective. So that's just something I've been more aware of in my own categorization of high and low Christologies. Uh,
We
Yeah.
just went live.
It's a
yes.
continuum for sure. I mean,
Yeah. Welcome to the Bible Geeks. Listeners Hangout, because
Welcome.
we're live now. Welcome,
Uh-oh.
everyone.
better I'll stop talking now.
No, keep going.
No, I'm kidding.
Now, isn't the Christology considered high because it's the nature of what Jesus is, that, he's a being, is somehow able to walk on water? This is like had some kind of spiritual meaning. There was like some kind of hierarchy of being that placed him in a different category than, say, someone like Moses?
It depends, who you ask. Like some people are like, oh, that's such like Poseidon language. Jesus can control water like Poseidon, but there's also elements like, oh, he's calming the chaotic waters just like God does in Genesis. So there's divinic language right there. So Mark isn't coming out and saying Jesus is God, but he's indicating his divinity. And it's one of those things where it's like, is he? Is he really? And that's why I go back and forth on the issue. Just so listeners know, we're talking about Christologies. And the two common phrases that scholars use about Christology is high and low Christologies. Some scholars are trying to change that terminology to incarnational and adoptionistic Christology because they think high is more important than low. It's sort of a PC way of phrasing it, but generally when someone talks about a low Christology, they're talking about, in simple terms, a human Jesus becoming divine. A good way I was taught in my undergrad is to think about direction. You start low to the ground and you go high up into heaven. That's a low Christology. Jesus' movement goes upwards. A high Christology, as you can kind of figure, starts off really high. So Jesus is God. Jesus is light from light, God from God, and goes downwards to earth. God becomes flesh, takes on humanity. And one of the ways you can understand these is when you look at like these very big devotional language, when Jesus is no longer understood in what we could understand purely messianic and prophetic language, but when he starts to be understood in divine language and godly language. So I hope that clears things up for listeners.
Isn't there other forms of Christology, though? Because there's the theory I can't think of. Hey, Jimmy. Sorry, my kid's going off. Theophany Christology, where the parallels being drawn to the Old Testament are a way of signaling a theophany of Yahweh in the person of Jesus. So isn't that an alternate kind of Christology apart from what you were talking about?
I would say so. Like, for example, that's when we get into the sticky waters where it's like Gnostic Christology, where Jesus is some sort of wisdom teacher from another realm. And like some people would say, well, isn't that high Christology? But it's like, well, some Gnostics would not equate Jesus with God, and that's that whole really tricky stuff of like, what is a Gnostic, and how can you really categorize Gnostic Christologies under this whole umbrella? So you're absolutely right. There are different interpretations. It's sort of like these two ginormous umbrella terms. For example, it's one of the problems with this is even though Matthew and Luke, for example, share what we might call low Christologies, they go about it in different ways. For example, in Luke, Jesus is innocent. He's like, that's so much is emphasis on that. And his creation, so his origin goes all the way back, if you look at the genealogy, to Adam. So there's that, the new Adam, the better man. And while that's sort of low, it's completely different to Matthew, where Matthew is like Jesus is the better Moses, the greater Moses, the truest teacher of the Torah. So it's one of those things where it's like, okay, they're both low Christologies, but they go about it in different ways, so can we really categorize them so easily together? Yeah, semantics, I know, but it's one of those things people talk about a lot around classrooms.
Yeah, it blends together a lot of that stuff, doesn't it? Oh, the cat's in a feisty mood. When I was setting up that class for Dr. Price, the cat was trying to chat with the salesperson. It's really funny. Just walking all over the keyboard. Hope he doesn't do that today.
Well, what makes me wonder is if Paul had even a higher Christology than the Synoptics, which I guess that's arguable, or if anyone at the time thought Jesus was God, why on earth would any one of the three not put that in there basically explicitly? You know, yeah, you obviously Jesus is some kind of super powerful human. I mean, like you said, he can control the weather, he can walk on water, and then all the miracles during his ministry. But that's not quite the same thing as what John in the Gospel of John, where he's basically saying Jesus is God. You know, that's a whole different. That's qualitatively different, in my opinion, not just quantitatively different.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and that's why I think like the conception in the Synoptics remind me of a lot of the ancient biographies, like almost like demigod kind of language. Like, yeah, they're not quite gods, but they definitely have superpowers. They have, you know, the virgin birth, you know, stuff like that, where they're kind of in between. So then that's why it's hard to really put your finger on classifying it.
I think one of the problems is we try and map this out like a trajectory, where we try and see a domino effect, where it's like, oh, well, he starts off as this, and then one domino falls down, and eventually we get to Nicaea. And when we start to look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Thomas, Judas, and when we look at our trajectories, it's much more like a tree branch, and it just like completely goes all over the place.
It's not a neat, orderly progression.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions. And when we talk about, you know, Christology, it's not so much we're studying Christology, we're studying Christologies. There's so many different ways. And in terms of like your earlier question about why didn't they just come out and say Jesus was God, really good point. I think they just don't know how to do it. I don't think someone like, I don't think Mark, for example, thinks Jesus is God. But I don't think Mark really knows who Jesus is for him fundamentally. I think one of the problems is we have to stop saying, like, imagining the evangelist Mark, whoever he was, on the same level as Thomas Aquinas. You know, Mark was a gospel writer, whoever that community was. He wasn't exactly a systematic theologian.
Yeah.
So that's sort of one of the things I say where Christologies aren't neat and tidy. You know, they're not. The Gospels aren't textbooks. You know, we try and pry through them bit by bit what we can, but sometimes we're just at a loss.
Yeah, that's a good point about Mark, especially. I mean, yeah, he wouldn't have been, even though I think he was an educated Greek-speaking person. I don't think he necessarily would have been very highly trained in philosophy or, you know, stuff like that. So yeah, maybe he didn't have a way to really put it into words that he thought that. But I don't know. I mean, it's possible that all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, thought Jesus was God, and not a single one of them knew how to put it into words in their gospel. But then again, it's also possible that they just didn't think that, and that's why we don't find it in there.
Yeah. I like Larry Hurtado's book, Lord Jesus Christ. And in that big book, he studies all the devotional stuff to Jesus. Really good book. And his ultimate theory is that devotion to Jesus came before theology to Jesus. Devotion to Jesus came first. Theology about Jesus came later. And
Yeah.
what he talks about is more the ecstatic, the emotional. When they're caught up in the excitement of the second coming, all of these sort of like fervor of like theological statements about Jesus comes out in worship and liturgy and prayer and things like that. But when they start understanding what they're saying, then they have to start thinking about what they're saying, and that starts this sort of chain reaction of Christologies. That's a very broad overview of a lot of Hurtado's theories, but I think he might be onto something. I think we take it, we try and have this idea that, like I said before, that they're sitting down writing systematic theological treatments about the nature and being of Jesus, like a first century Thomas Aquinas. When I think they're probably responding to their own experience of Jesus, whatever that was, and their traditions about Jesus that they've received, and what they think is going to happen to them in relation to Jesus. So I think so much of it is personal to that community's understanding and their own worldview. Like, what's the Roman Empire doing to them? What are the Jews doing to them? How are they praying? Who do they like? Which apostles do they favor over the others? All of that, I think, is like fleshing in together how they understand Jesus.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yay, we agree.
But whoever John was, I think he definitely obviously had the philosophical training to put it into words what he thought. And it wouldn't surprise me if the synoptics just represent an earlier stage of not necessarily Christianity as a whole, but maybe certain communities of Christianity they hadn't quite gotten to that step where Jesus is God, one with the same thing, you know. Whereas you get to John, and he's pretty much putting, I think, later beliefs of Christians at a later stage into the story of Jesus' life and even into Jesus' mouth. And he obviously has a good philosophical understanding. He talks about the Logos and, like, you know, all that stuff. I and the Father are one.
There's also like an early understanding, I think, the concept of the divine man. Don't ask me to...
Theos on earth.
Yeah, okay, thank you. The Greek word for it is. The conceptions that they had may not correspond to what we would consider divinity or as we would understand it, but they might have had different conceptions of what it meant to be a demigod or a godlike man or an expression of the divine or an incarnated emanation from the pleroma. It's hard to say because there's a different mixing. There's mixing of different Christologies even in the synoptics. So exactly who believed what is kind of a tangled mess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing to keep in mind with John, I think John represents like the straw breaking the camel's back between Judaism and Christianity more than any other sort of gospel. While the other gospels are separating with Judaism, John is like pushing
a whole new thing.
Yeah, like John is clearly a Jewish thinker. Like there's so much Jewish imagery in his gospel. Jesus sits on the well, much like the new temple. Jesus is the new and greater temple, and Jesus
is the Passover lamb.
The Passover lamb. Yeah, exactly. He is the tabernacle that doesn't go out, the light of the world. So there's so much Jewish stuff in there, but at the same time, there's so much stuff that's just completely separate from Judaism. So it's that beautiful contradiction that we get in the Gospel of John. Well, I think it's a beautiful contradiction. It's a fascinating gospel to study.
Oh, it's my favorite gospel. I love it. Like, even though I think it's not representative of really early formative Christianity, I still love. I've heard that I can't read Greek, but I've heard the Greek is kind of crude, or maybe I'm thinking of Revelation. I don't know. But
Yeah. It's meant to be very stylized, very, very, very stylized from what I've studied.
Okay, I'm probably mixing them up then. Revelation's supposed to be super crude, I've heard.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because Jerome did not think the Apostle John wrote Revelation precisely because he says the Greek in Revelation is too crude. It's not the same author, which once again, sort of what I was saying last week. We think we're so clever in the modern world sometimes, but sometimes you got to give credit to the patristic writers that they could tell a few things for themselves.
For sure.
Was Jerome before 1950?
No. Have you read? Have you read Elaine Pagel's book on the Gospel of Thomas and John?
I haven't.
No.
It's an interesting theory where she puts forth that the Gospel of John was written in competition against Thomas. That the reason why Thomas is doubting and is a bit of a not so much unlikable, but like he's a bit more downplayed is precisely because of a polemic against a sort of proto-Gnosticism that is starting to hold on to the Gospel of Thomas. I'm not sure how much I buy it, but it is, it's something interesting to think about. I recommend the book.
I read something about that, but I think it was in a summary of the ideas rather than any kind of article that she did. So, but I did hear that recently. I read that.
Yeah. It's my thesis supervisor, Dr. Fergus King from the University of Newcastle. He's actually going on a different route. He thinks that John was written, as a polemic against the Manichaeans. So. But I think I'm not sure who's going to publish his book, but it's going to be terribly expensive, so no one's going to read it. But I'm excited to get my hand on the PDF file when he sends it to me.
Wait for the Kindle version. Some of those books they do end up being Kindles, but they're like $29.95 Kindle books. Yeah.
Well, probably my favorite one is I wanted to get N.T. Wright's new book, Paul and the Faithfulness of God. Very big, very expensive. And the Kindle version was only $2 cheaper at the time. I just couldn't believe it.
Does anybody study economics in publishing anymore? I mean, they're shooting themselves in the foot all the time.
Yeah.
So Dr. Price managed to get the podcast from October 16th to me. So I went ahead and broadcast it on Ustream and recorded it at the same time. But right now, that's the only way to get it because there's usually a delay. Serjan, who I mentioned to you earlier in the chat on Facebook, he's the one that actually uploads the MP3 to the RSS feed, and that ends up feeding iTunes and so forth. So right now, the only way to get it is to get it from the Ustream channel. So I fell asleep during the podcast, and it kind of went over. That happens to me a lot. So it starts repeating itself, because it's just a recording. So I thought that's kind of funny. There were some interesting things in there. I don't know if anybody listened to it. I discussed it if people had listened to it, but if not, we can go and talk about Mark's longer ending. Unless did everybody do their homework over the last couple of weeks and read that PDF I posted from Delbert Burkett's book about why he thinks the longer ending is often a part of the original Mark. Well, not original Mark, but it legitimately Mark.
I actually forgot to read that. I'm sorry.
Wah.
I know what you're talking about, and I tried reading it, but unfortunately I had thesis work to do, so I was planning on winging it from what I remember about the longer and shorter endings of Mark.
Well, as soon as I was reading it, I'm disagreeing with it right away because, I've read a lot of Metzger's work and a lot of text criticism about and reasons for their exclusion of it as being an authentic ending of Mark. So, in a nutshell, he said that originally it was all external evidence that people rejected it. Eventually, scholarship changed to internal evidence, where they were looking at things like vocabulary and a bunch of other stuff, and then the manuscript evidence and so forth. But his argument for it is that, first of all, he dealt with all those arguments, and that's where he lost me, is because I don't think his arguments against, say, like the internal evidence was very strong. But the main thing that I thought of was there still is some valid external evidence that speaks very, well against it being included, namely that it is constructed, and you can very much see where each of the elements of the longer ending is taken from Luke, Mark, and even John. And I think that's been established scholarly, I wouldn't say forever, but is generally considered valid that the longer ending is a construct, and you can see where it was constructed from. And to me, that, even though that's external evidence, that's still, for me, very decisive compared to internal arguments in favor of that being part of Mark's plan, having that particular ending. And that's just one reason. So everybody agrees? Okay, let's move on to something else.
Were there manuscripts with different endings, with different long endings?
Yeah, there was actually a shorter ending, a longer ending, and then there was, what was that other one? I can't think of it now.
Isn't there one that just says there's a shorter ending, and there's one that I think Jesus appears and just says he appears to Peter and teaches the apostles to go east, west, and all that. But then there's the longer ending that we all know.
Yeah. Now there's the I think they call it the Freer, F-R-E-E-R manuscript, where it actually includes an additional paragraph of Jesus speaking to the apostles, and that, I think, ends with the, if I'm not mistaken, the shorter ending. But I think there's some variance on that, but basically all the longer endings are the same. And that was one of Burkett's other arguments, is that as far back as you go, when the longer ending is included, it's always essentially the same. There's no wide variations in it. So if it was inauthentic, it became part of the gospel at a very early date. And even some of the manuscripts where that don't include it, like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, some of them make note, like a modern equivalent of footnotes being, say, like asterisks or something, that either this is considered problematic or doesn't include it, but there should have been something there. In other words, they're aware that there's an ending that they're not including. Now that's an interesting point, that it does go, and even Metzger crew on United Bible Society does mention that what's usually considered the best manuscripts often show evidence either of support or acknowledged existence of it, enough to make note of it. So, point taken, but I still think that there's other reasons why it's not. And there's also the argument that Mark makes sense without it too, as well. I think we were discussing Carrier earlier, Daniel, and he, that's one of his main arguments that he broaches in his talks when he's talking about the Gospel of Mark is there's a structure that runs through the entire Gospel, and that the ending there matches the beginning, how the Gospel was entered into.
Oh yeah, like that theory.
Yeah,
that theory is old as.
Yeah, that's not even original. Yeah.
Yeah. And I used to really it's one of those things that I think is very distinct about Mark's Gospel, that there is a lot of dramatic irony in it. There's lots of mystery, and the disciples always get Jesus wrong, and all the unlike. That's clearly a motif. But one of the things that did strike me in reassessing this question, and did Mark intend it to end the way it did? One of the things that I find interesting is that the ending has, he will meet you in Galilee. He will meet the disciples in Galilee. It's very distinctive.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen. So it's one of those things where it's like, well, is this an unfulfilled prophecy then? Or is this like to be continued, like the destruction of Jerusalem isn't reported inside the Gospel? So, it's one of those things where I'm not sure how I feel about it, because, did whoever was writing it just give up the ghost before he could finish it? Is it just lost to us? Like the back page was just so damaged. It's one of those things where I don't know. Like I'm pretty much like, I'm pretty sure I think it's meant to end that way, but the other theories do come into my mind every once in a while, and I have to think about them. What do you guys think about the alternative ending theories?
I don't think it was meant to end that.
Conspiracy.
I think we probably lost some part of the original longer ending. That's one of the main reasons is, he specifically says that he'll meet the disciples in Galilee, and then it ends. No resurrection appearance, even though he's preaching the whole time that he'll be raised up after 3 days. Blah 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 blah. Unless there's some weird literary reason why he wouldn't do it, I just can't see why he would end it that way. I think we probably did lose an original longer ending. Plus, doesn't it end like in the middle of a sentence?
That's one of the big reasons why people think the original ending is completely lost to us, because the Greek literally almost trails off. Like, it's not even a formal ending sentence. That's one of the main reasons, as you point out. So you good job on pointing that out, Doug. So yeah, it's one of those things where it's one of the reasons why I keep entertaining the idea that maybe the original ending is lost to us. So
if only they had used periods back then.
Or decent English where they put articles and prepositions where they belong in sentences. Because I originally thought that that it was a lost ending. Then I entertained the idea that it was a suppressed ending, where Jesus was kidnapped and held for ransom or something like that, but not acceptable. Had to be chopped off. And then I've heard other explanations that I think Dr. Price went into some of this too. I'm not sure I agree with it, but for what it's worth, that you don't really have to ask what happened, because you know what happened. I mean, you wouldn't have heard of Jesus had he not gone and fulfilled everything that he said he would have. So it's a way of Mark talking over the heads of the characters in the story to the readers, the reader response thing. So
well, that's one of my earliest lecturers. I don't think he formally argued this anywhere, but something he was working on, I don't know if he ever published it, was he had the idea that maybe Mark was used in its earliest form as liturgy. and it purposely ends the way it does because that's when the presbyter, the leader, addresses the initiates and says, "But will you be afraid?" And the response is no, and that's when they come forward and get baptized and be initiated into the Christian community.
I like that performance piece idea. It's the orality of it all. It's just that's kind of appealing to me in a way. I wish I knew more about it, but I'd like to look more into that kind of.
That was his idea of it, but I don't think he ever formally argued it. I think one of the things he did was he looked at the Diacade and saw that there were sort of similar themes in the response and in the way Mark is presented, but I don't know. I'm just going off memory here from a coffee session a few years ago.
Now, does everyone think John 21 is an addition on chapter 21?
Yeah.
I guess everyone pretty much.
Somebody vacuuming or something? There's vacuuming going on somewhere?
Hearing a loud, like.
That's probably my computer overheating.
Oh, damn. Are you on a laptop?
Wow.
No, it's a HP. It's just.
Oh, okay.
It's actually a brand new spanking computer. It's just.
It's one of those monsters with water coolant radiators and 5 fans and stuff.
It's actually an SSD, so it shouldn't be as noisy as it is. So.
Yeah, my HP laptop, which finally died back in March or April or something, that was loud too. You could hear that. I couldn't record anything, that I wanted to do serious audio because you could hear that the computer just running. That little tiny fan making so much noise. But actually I got it running because I was setting it on the air conditioning vent, so the cool air all summer was keeping it running, but the video completely went out. So I can remote control it and access it through Windows Remote Access and actually do stuff on it. But pretty soon, the vents are going to be blowing warm air, and I think it's not going to last anymore like it was before. But I can still make use of it. Right now I'm trying to crack a password on a zip file or something, and it's just running, billions of permutations.
You hacker.
Yeah. Well, I was... Before there was an internet, when there was bulletin boards, I was involved in that kind of stuff. So that was the milieu I started in. It was like rogue hackers, But when the internet came around, I already kind of moved off from that, to more white hat kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
Man, we're just trying to.
Don't forget all those skills, though. A lot of those skills still.
We've gone from high and low Christologies to the ending of Mark, and we just wrapped up the ending of John. Man, we're just blazing through it tonight, Bible Geeks.
Well, we're in a unique group, aren't we? Well, this stuff is, we're all over this stuff anyway. I mean, during the day, about the same amount of topics are running through my head because of something I just read. And I'm throwing all this stuff together. It's all churning around in there, in my throbbing super brain.
I was listening to a Barterman teaching course, or teaching company lecture thing today.
The great courses?
Yeah, and he was talking about, I actually didn't like it very much. It was about the formation of the New Testament canon, but really didn't talk about the actual formation until like the last lecture, and it was just really brief. The rest of it was just going over like contradictions and the stuff you always hear from Barterman. But
I had a bunch of his teaching courses, but I only watched a few of them. I preferred like either his audiobooks or his debates, or anytime that he's actually lecturing in front of an audience. I think that's when I really like to listen to him, because he has to be a lot more concise.
Yeah, that's true.
The other thing is a lot of those great courses were recorded nearly 2 decades ago, so I think he's sort of gotten into the groove a bit more about being a presenter and a public speaker and how to be engaging. And I definitely agree. I think he's very good in a more the hour-long congregation format, John. I think he works really well on that. I also like listening to him on Unbelievable, the Christian radio. Whenever he's on that, I always find that really entertaining.
Yeah, anytime he's interviewed, I always listen to it because I think he's a great scholar. I mean, he deserves all the praise,
Mm-hmm.
except for that one book. Anyway, what was I going to say about something about? Oh, who I really love to listen to is you were talking earlier, Mark Goodacre, because his British smooth voice. I believe anything that's anybody tells me in a British accent, I just accept it right away.
Oh yeah. That's Goodacre is another great communicator. I wish he was in more interviews and lectures. He was in. Unfortunately, it was one of those really cheesy like History Channel documentaries called "The Family of Jesus." And at that stage, I was very young, and I was in my staunch Catholic phase. So, like, Jesus didn't have brothers or sisters; they were all his cousins. And actually, listening to Goodacre talk about it, and he's in like I can still remember it because he's got that young PhD, and he's just sitting there in this British spouting all this knowledge, and I was totally just like playing into his hand. I'm like, oh wow, I better check this out. And it's probably because he had a British accent.
Exactly. I thought it was just an American phenomenon. So I was going to ask you how that goes over in Oz. Whether the same phenomenon occurs down under. But I guess it does, right?
No, I'm going to. Once I'm done studying for the GRE, I'm gonna throw my hat in the ring for Duke because I'd love to work with Goodacre.
So do you go along with Goodacre on no Q?
Certainly do.
So you're a somewhat of a fringe guy in that respect, I guess.
Yeah, it's actually nice being on the fringe for a change. I actually I got introduced to it from basically my academic background was from what you could call the new neo-Tübingen school of thought. I want to write a paper on this because basically Bauer, F.C. Bauer has sort of come back in style, unknowing to a lot of people. A lot of the views being espoused by people are so Bauer entrenched in Bauer's thinking, and people just don't even realize it, or they're not giving Bauer the correct props. And so I've coined the phrase the neo-Tübingen school of thought. Anyway, long story cut short. Two of my biggest influences, Dr. Ian Elmer, who wrote a great book called Paul, Jerusalem, and the Judaizers. Excellent book about the Galatian crisis, continuing a lot of the work set by Bauer, and the late, great Michael Goulder. And another one is Dr. David C. Sim, and his book, Christian Judaism and the Gospel of Matthew. A really good book if you can get your hands on it. Unfortunately, it's out of print. But he talks about, like, a lot of his thesis is that Matthew is anti-Pauline, that Matthew is actually written from an anti-Paul perspective. So continuing.
I definitely agree with that.
Oh yeah, but no scholar does. It's such a frick. So right there.
I don't see how they couldn't think that there's some anti-Paul, or at least anti.
I thought that was the mainstream. Yeah, I thought that was the mainstream.
No, it's not. You check out all the commentaries want Matthew to be pro, Gentile mission, pro Paul in some way. It's like.
Well, it does have the Great Commission, but it also has the Sermon on the Mount thing about the law, which seems.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I'm trying to get a public. Novum Testamentum is currently looking at one of my papers and trying to get peer reviewed. Knock on wood. And basically, I look at the anti-Gentile sayings and the pro-Gentile sayings in Matthew, and my conclusion is that Gentiles probably were allowed in Matthew's community on the condition that they converted to Judaism, that they became Jewish proselytes.
Now, do you think Matthew was an Ebionite, or that the gospel came out of an Ebionite community?
It probably did, but they probably would not refer to themselves as Ebionites.
Right, that was their label from other people, yeah.
Yeah. My understanding is what I think happened I agree with Dr. Sim, David Sim, once again, from the Australian Catholic University. Got his PhD from King's College in London, so it's not a crank, just want to throw that out there. But anyway, I agree with him that probably after the Antioch crisis, Paul and his law-free fanboys and fangirls got kicked out of Antioch. So Peter and James and the Jerusalem community basically pitched their tent in Antioch. So James was in charge of Jerusalem, and probably for the most part, I think Peter used Antioch as his sort of missionary base camp, and Antioch becomes a law-abiding community, a Torah-observant community. Jerusalem falls in the year 70. The Jerusalem church, for the most part, is wiped out. What we have are the refugees probably fleeing to Antioch, and they're like sort of reinvigorating. So they're oppressed on the one hand against the Roman Empire. They have that like the great tribulation in their mind with the early apocalyptic birth pangs. But on the other time, they're starting to feel antagonistic towards post-temple Judaism, so they're feeling oppression on that side.
Mm-hmm.
So my opinion is that that's probably, and they're probably trying to warn people against the law-free gospel that these heretical Christians are talking about. And what's really interesting is if you put the clock forward with Ignatius of Antioch, the bishop of Antioch, with the so-called Ebionites, it seems that he has to lead a mission against these Christian Jews. That's how strong they are already in Antioch. So I think there's very strong evidence for Matthew coming from a Christian Jewish community in Antioch after the fall of Jerusalem.
But before the time of Ignatius, obviously. Or before the more Paulinist community started.
Yeah, before Paul's come back, basically.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Basically, time is settled, and it's like, let's take it back, guys. It's we lost that share, now it's cheap. Let's take it over.
It makes you wonder. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
When we're reading parables of war, think about what Daniel just said, because I think it's significant that that movement is centered in Syria, because I think that's where the core of Revelation comes from, is in that milieu as well.
Yes, if you want to sort of get the brief of it, the lovely Mark Goodacre has done a review of Dr. Sim's book, and I'll post the links on the YouTube page, but it's on academia.edu and under Mark Goodacre's website. But yeah, The Gospel of Matthew and Christian Judaism, The History and Social Settings of the Matthean Community by David C. Sim.
So in this review, he kind of sums up the main arguments of Sim.
Yeah. It's only about 4 pages, and he sums up Sim's main argument. And once again, Goodacre is one of those people who I identify with the Neo-Tübingen school of thought.
Really?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In some of his other writings, he really emphasizes the difference between Paul and James, like just how antagonistic Paul and James were to one another.
Have you ever read, what is that guy's name? Michael Goulder's book, St. Paul versus St. Peter?
Yeah, that's his little popular book, which is pretty good. I disagree with a lot of it, but the main thesis of it is good. But my honours thesis for the University of Newcastle was actually a continuation of his main thesis. One of the problems I have with Bauer and his disciples is that when it comes to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, they're obsessed with chapters 1 to 4, which has the famous slogans and the real divisions and things like that. But when you get to chapter 7, that's when Paul's community writes, Paul addresses his community and says, to the things that you wrote me about, and everyone seems to focus on the whole virginity stuff and the marriage stuff, things like that. But when you get down to verse 19, boom, do not seek circumcision, do not seek uncircumcision. And it's
in Galatians 2, Paul goes off, he explodes because he hears that the Galatians are circumcising, because some false people have come around saying they need to follow the law and get circumcised, and he flips out.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And one of the things that I was shocked, because I agree with Bauer for the most, I agree with Gulda and Bauer and Sim and Elmer when it comes to their studies of the Corinthian crisis, that there are Judaizers in Corinth attempting to cause discord. I agree with that. And but they don't focus on the circumcision. They completely ignore the circumcision stuff. So I wrote my 67-page thesis on it. So it's been a lot of fun doing it, actually. And that will be on academia soon once it gets reviewed. So yeah.
So what's a book that you would recommend that's a really comprehensive scholarly book on Peter versus Paul, like the disagreements between the Jerusalem church and Paul's gospel?
Probably the easiest and the most approachable is the one you recommended by Gulda, St. Peter versus
Okay, I have that one. I haven't read it yet, but it was recommended to me.
The other one I would recommend, if you're interested in getting a little bit more into it, Paul and the Competing Mission at Corinth by Michael Gulda is sort of the more intense one.
Oh, okay.
That's an excellent book. While I'm not the biggest fan of his scholarship, if you can borrow it from the library, Paul and Jesus by James Tabor, the very last chapter is called Paul against the super apostles, and it's one chapter, and it really explains the differences between Paul and Peter and James. So it's one chapter. If you've got access to, you can read it online. Oh no, wait, actually, I know. The best one, and I'm not just saying this because he's one of my closest friends and mentors. Ian Elmer's book, Paul, Jerusalem and Judaizers. It studies the Galatian crisis in its broadest historical context, and you can get the full PDF. It's his doctoral thesis for the Australian Catholic University. There's the link there, and to me, it's the game. To me, this was a game-changing piece to read. When I read this, and it is a doctoral thesis, so it is pretty heavy-going at times, but this convinced me that Paul and Peter were not friends, that they were enemies to the end.
So then you agree that Acts is just a story trying to smooth over the what was really a major conflict.
Yes, I think one of Acts' primary motivations, among other things, is to harmonize Peter with Paul again.
Yeah. I think even within Paul, I mean, you've got Galatians, and I mean, I forget what passages it's in chapter 1 where he's talking about when he goes to Jerusalem, and he's so adamant about, I only met with James, the brother of the Lord, and Paul, and I'll have to find the exact thing because I forget how he worded it.
Yeah, basically he says that he didn't receive his revelation from humans. And when he went to Jerusalem, no one knew his face. He only met with Peter and James, the brother of
Which that
Lord.
doesn't jive with Acts either, because Acts puts him in
Yeah.
Jerusalem several times before
Yeah.
that meeting.
Yeah.
While he was supposedly persecuting Christians, so they would have known who he was.
Yeah, and this is the thing. I don't think Paul was persecuting law-observant Christians. I think he was persecuting the Hellenists. Like, this is where I think Acts is somewhat right. I think that there were law-free Christians, you could say, Torah-free Christians already, or at least there were like elements of it in some communities. And you could probably see that in maybe like people like Stephen and things like that. But they were operating in Damascus, and that's who Paul was persecuting. He was persecuting those people who were not obeying the Torah. I don't think he would have cared about James and Peter. They would have been weird to him because they were following a crucified Messiah. Like, they would have been weird to him, but I don't think he would have persecuted them with how Torah observant they are, law observant, kosher following, Sabbath observing.
Yeah.
I don't think he would have cared about them.
What makes me wonder, though, is what really happened to Paul to completely reverse him, to where he's becomes this Hellenistic, don't worry about the law. In fact, not only don't worry about the law will put in jeopardy your justification.
Yeah. I have a fictional story that I like to reconstruct, and it's purely a work of fiction, but one of the ideas I came up with, if I ever wrote a Paul novel or something, my understanding is I would sort of take Acts and twist it to a more naturalistic way where he's persecuting Christians in Damascus, and he hits his head and gets knocked out in the fury, and rather than, beating him to death, a group of Christians, mend his
Presses him
wound.
into service? What do you mean?
What's that?
He hits his head and...
Yeah, like...
battling Christians.
Yeah, it's basically like he's persecuting them, but then something happens where he like hits his head and gets knocked out and he's blind or something.
And all of a sudden now he doesn't want to follow the law?
No. Like basically, in a Christian household, rather than hurting him because he's they like nurse him back to health, and because they do that, it creates some sort of trauma, and he doesn't, and so he goes off into Arabia and tries to figure out what the hell is going on. Like I said, it's purely fictional, but it's just an idea I had.
I thought it was going off in the direction of like when in Batman, when King Tut hits his head, he's a professor until he gets his head hit, and then he becomes an arch criminal. Then if something hits him in the head, he becomes a mild-mannered professor again. That's what I thought you were going with that.
What I wonder is, I don't think Paul originated the schism from Jewish Christianity. I think he got caught up in that movement, probably.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. I think, and I wrote a paper on this, once again, it's self-aggrandizing, so I'm sorry for being a wanker, but my theory is that I think that Paul was probably a minor functionary in Antioch, and then when the kerfuffle happened, that's when he sort of rose up. That's when I think he found his real calling. That when the drama was playing out between Jerusalem and Antioch, and everybody was sort of falling into line, something within him, I think, just completely was a contradiction to that freedom, as he calls it, in Christ. Mm-hmm. And he just couldn't, I've stand enough, I can stand no more. And I think that was when he did that, that's when he became an apostle. Like, that's when he said, this is my calling. It was a lot. I think Paul's calling was not unlike many people's callings. That it was a long, drawn-out process that took him a long time to figure it out, and it was in the heat of conflict that he really figured it. like most people, I think. I don't
Yeah.
think Paul was unlike our own, but that's a paper I wrote on it when I tried to reconstruct what I thought Paul's calling was like. But, yeah.
Now, what's interesting is if Matthew used Mark, the Markan community, unless some of the stuff in Mark's gospel is later redaction, you know, and so he declared all foods clean, blah 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 blah. If Matthew came out of an Ebionite community or whatever they called themselves, what was he doing using Mark's gospel with stuff in it like and he declared all foods clean? You know, why would he
Yeah.
want to use it unless that stuff was added later to Mark?
That's one of those things where I've tried to figure out that, and if you can get your hands on it, David Sim, once again name dropping, he has a theory where he thinks that what he was trying to do is actually supplant Mark. That basically Matthew's community gets their hand on Mark, they're horrified by it, but they try to sort of like supplant it. They try to that was the alpha. This is the the final production. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think that, and something that Dr. Sim pointed out to me is that I think is quite true. Is that we're dealing with a time when there probably isn't that much Jesus material out there, so it's not like Mark and it's not like Matthew can just work from scratch. If Matthew, because of how much he keeps of Mark, clearly there's some stuff he agrees with, and it's probably like, even though Paul and James disagreed with one another, Paul is still trying to get Jerusalem's favor. He's still trying to win them over with the donations and things like that. It's one of those things where it's like, even though they disagree with each other, it still looks like Paul tried to reconcile. So maybe Matthew is trying to reconcile with Gentile Christianity by replacing it.
Yeah, that's possible, I guess. I think Paul did try and reconcile, but I think it blew up in his hands. And that's why he starts going apeshit in Galatians, and I don't think he had a good meeting with the pillars in Jerusalem.
Oh yeah, I totally agree.
I don't think that they ironed things out at all. I think they left the meeting ended on really bad terms, I would say.
Well, if you go with
Matthew's use,
that would be the perception if you're going by Paul. And most people consider Acts as apologetic.
yeah, if you can get your hands on a Cambridge access, it's called Matthew's. Where is it? Matthew's use of Mark. Did Matthew intend to supplant or replace his primary source? Really good article. Very, very interesting with how
I kind of thought that all the major gospels were supplanting each other or attempting to. That was my impression. Each one was trying to outdo the others with a better version that, and the other ones would just fall by the wayside.
I agree with that, but so many scholars don't. So many think that they're like trying to keep harmony and like, oh, it's this common communion of the saints, and I just don't see that at all.
Are they all closet Catholics like me?
Well, it's sort of like what I was talking to you about earlier today, John. It seems to me that people just a lot of evangelicals get to Revelation, and then it's like, okay, we better wait for Martin Luther now. And it's like, well, hold on. What about Marcion and Irenaeus and Ignatius and Polycarp? And it's like, nope. Let's get to Martin Luther. Everything else is commentary. Like,
I guess they weren't, content with just translating the English Bible with Protestant terminology and keywords. The Reformation instead of what was the word that was used in the Catholic Bible for that? Oh no, I lost it. Sorry.
Yes.
Anyway, back to that teaching company thing. He was talking about the difference between First and Second Thessalonians, and how in First Thessalonians seems like the end is at hand. Christ was the first fruits, and he's saying to the church, they're like, hey, people have died. Are they going to miss out? And he's like, no, don't worry. When Jesus comes back, we're all going to get called up into heaven, including the people who've fallen asleep, and blah, 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 blah. And then in Second Thessalonians, it's like, don't listen to these letters supposedly written by me saying that the end is at hand. All these things have to happen at first. Like, it's just a total correction of First Thessalonians. I was just like, man. Anyway, he put it in a really good way that made me understand it very well, because I'm still really new to all this stuff. So
yeah, it's really hilarious. Like when you read, like, to me, and I don't know what your guys' religious backgrounds is, but when I was a Christian and I was fairly evangelical, and I thought all of this was the Word of God, inspired and perfect, and I thought Paul wrote all those letters that the Bible told me he did. It's one of those things that now I don't know how I didn't see it. Like I kind of wish I could go back in time in a bubble and watch myself and just scream at myself, like, how can you not see these things? Like,
well, what's more amazing is, how about these guys who are like James White, who are professional debaters? They know all of the scholarship. They're aware of all the counterarguments. And yet they come up with these crazy apologetic gymnastics. It's like, how can they? It just blows my mind how they can't.
The one person,
obvious evidence there.
The one person who made me reconsider for half a second 2 Thessalonians was authentic was Luke Timothy Johnson from Emory. But it was half a second. It was half a second, and that was it. Like, so.
I don't think that period of my life is over yet where I'm going to suddenly think, how could I have not recognized
Oh yeah.
that? I think that, I keep experiencing that over and over again.
Oh yeah, it never ends, I don't think. But once you start into that, once you make that, cross that gulf, you just continually keep getting blown, like, whoa. How did I never notice? How did I not ever notice this? Or how did I ever think these?
I was warned in entering into theological seminary. One of the sayings that one of my priest friends used was, "Be careful, there be dragons." Yeah, once you start asking these questions, you can't stop.
Say it again?
Well, like, this is the thing. The priest who told me this, she's a good Episcopalian, liberal, progressive, great gal. But it's one of those things where it's like, well, what's the alternative? I don't ask questions, and I don't. And at that stage, it was like, I want to draw closer to God, so I should ask these questions, right? And
yeah, I mean, if it's the truth, asking questions shouldn't hurt anything.
Yeah.
If you only question, but don't draw any conclusions.
Yeah. But yeah, it's sort of one of those things where I really like Marcus Borg's statement, reading the Bible again for the first time. I think that phrase really does encapsulate it a lot, that you have to sort of reread it again for the first time. And after I lost my faith, and I just said, screw it, I'm just going to earn money, and then I lost my soul to retail, and I kind of had to find. What was really funny is, I fell in love with the Bible again for the first time. I fell in love with the Bible again, but for completely different reasons.
That's like deja vu. I mean, Dr. Price said that multiple times, that it was like seeing it with fresh eyes and even appreciating it more.
Yeah, a much richer and more bountiful study from it. Yeah, it's just a totally different book. He always says when you look at it with a through critical eyes. You know,
Mm.
there's so much more to it. You haven't ironed out all the subtleties.
What's sort of interesting for me now is, um, a lot of religious people talk about how the Bible inspires them in their darkest moments and things like that because they can hear God talking to them. And when I was a Christian, I sometimes felt that, but I never really got that. What's kind of weird now is sometimes I read the text and I do feel inspired by it, and I know it's not God talking to me or anything, but it's sort of like I can sort of take a step back, and the critical gears start to turn, and I'm like, you know what? I live in the 21st century in America and previously in Australia. I have a beautiful wife, and I get the privilege of talking to people about the same things, once a week, and I get to enjoy great coffee, and these guys were just like living in the first century. Screw that.
Yeah, I mean, I still love Christian liturgy, and I think some of it's just so beautiful, and that's never left me, even though I lost my faith a long time ago. I mean, I still love a lot of Christian sermonizing and stuff like that. Even though I don't believe it, I just think it's poetically beautiful and does have a meaning, even if you're not a believer. It can have a not necessarily spiritual meaning, but a philosophical or life outlook kind of meaning.
Yeah. For me,
There's
Christian
a lot
art.
of sentimentality. Oh,
Sorry,
sorry.
John?
A lot of sentimentality is mixed up in it too. If I go to
Probably too.
Catholic Mass, I'm tearing up because I'm thinking about all the years I spent going with my deceased parents and that. So
Hmm.
it's not just, and sometimes the liturgy does move me. When I'm really thinking about what's going on and what meaning it has for the people that are there for the to experience it specifically. But mainly, I think for me, it's kind of a sentimental thing.
On a really personal note, I dedicated my honors thesis to my friend Daniel. Yes, another Daniel. We were the two Daniels in class. We was two students together, and sadly, he killed himself. He committed suicide, and he was in training to become a uniting minister, uniting church minister. And he was a manic depressant, but um, he was like such a source of inspiration for me. And when I read some of the, like, he loved Paul. Like, Paul was his dude, as you can imagine, being such a
Yeah.
Protestant. And when I read some of the Pauline letters, I do tear up because I think about our we'd stay up till 1 o'clock in the morning talking about grand ministry plans and how we wanted to help people and change people's lives and what this verse meant to us and if we had seen. And it's one of those things where it's like, I don't feel foolish about that. Like, my faith was so important to me back then, and I wouldn't. And while I don't believe anymore, I wouldn't trade those moments. It was still
Right.
a profound human experience.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
admit it.
definitely.
Of course, you know what else makes me cry is that old Christmas show, Little Drummer Boy, when the lamb gets run over by the Roman chariot.
Oh,
Yeah, I just like, oh.
Yeah, dude, that's dark.
Yeah, but he was brought back to life by the baby Jesus. See?
Of course. Yes. Yeah. Well, guys, I'm going to have to leave you, but great talking to you as always, and I will see you guys on Sunday.
Great
cool.
seeing you, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for
Yeah,
dropping
great.
by.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Daniel. Thanks for giving us a lot of insight and links too.
Appreciate it.
Not a problem, guys. Thanks for letting me ramble. Night, all.
Night.
Good night.
Oh, we lost David too.
Oops. My wife wants me to put up a picture of my son's cross-country trophy. It's the first one he ever won. Because I have two sons, but the other one doesn't even care. Yeah, whatever. I'm not into that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, do you guys have any other topics you want to discuss?
No, actually, not really. I liked the way that today's Hangout went, where it was like a series of topics, like a regular discussion that you would have sitting around a table drinking coffee.
Yeah.
Smoking cigars, I really enjoyed that.
I was just reminded that same lecture I was listening to, Wayne, Ehrman mentioned some scholar, and I'll get you his name, I forget it right now, who was talking about the priestly source in Genesis 1. He said that, I forget the guy's name, but some other scholar had also argued that he thinks the organization into different days he was arguing that that was not original, that was a later addition to that text, which I thought was interesting. It reminded me of your whole chart there. So I'll get you the guy's name, and you can look into it.
That would be interesting to see, yeah.
Yeah. Some old-time scholar, I think, like 19th century scholar.
There's nothing new under the sun.
That's what it says.
Yeah, I posted that in Klingon on the Bible Geek listeners, but nobody commented on it. Because, they had the Klingon translation of the King James, I believe. So I looked that up and posted in because we were talking about, the languages of Game of Thrones, so I thought.
Oh, yeah.
Throw in derail people sometimes, just like, okay, we're going one way, and I'll throw something in and just like train wreck. So Wayne, you're kind of quiet. Did you have a topic you wanted to go over?
I think that's why I'm quiet. I'm just kind of zoning out.
Sometimes Tuesdays are good for me and sometimes not. I mean, I don't feel tired like I sometimes do at this time. But then again, it's like I was active in other stuff and not really Bible geeking it this week, so I didn't have a lot of things going on intellectually to, bring to the table.
See, most of the stuff I've been definitely geeking out. Like I'm reading probably reading and or listening to about 5 books at once right now. But I feel bad because most of this stuff is totally basic level, like newbie level stuff. So half the time I don't even want to bring it up because it's just like everyone's like, no shit. Or I mean, no one says that, but that's the response.
We're all thinking.
Yeah, we're all thinking that. Yeah. What? 2 Thessalonians doesn't agree with 1 Thessalonians? You don't say.
Well, a lot of people do because they just Googled it just then and there, and then they come back looking all erudite, But I can't. A lot of that stuff I can't pull out of my head, and I know that they can't either. And I've been reading this stuff for a while. I just can't. A lot of the things that come fast and furious, like on the Bible Geek listeners, is that I know these guys are doing research before they're posting, because except for Dr. Price, I can't think of people that can pull this stuff out of their head like that.
I think Reuben can.
Yeah, I would grant that.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I'm reading. I got a bunch of new teaching company stuff. Early Christian heresies. I got the canon thing, which I was really disappointed with, mainly because it was just rehashing of, a lot of stuff that was in misquoting Jesus. That took up like at least 75% of this formation of the New Testament canon lecture.
I think I got that one. But it's been a while. I think there's
That
a
book or the lecture?
the lecture and the book, because I think I got them together, which
Oh, okay.
really
Well,
helped.
there are a lot, yeah. But then I got some others, like one I really am excited to listen to. It's not by Ehrman, it's by Brad Gregory, called History of Christianity in the Reformation Era, which is really long too. And that's a spot where it's just a total black hole for me. Like I basically know who Calvin was and Martin Luther was, and I have a rough idea of the Reformation, but as far as details, I'm totally ignorant. So that's going to be fun. And then I got another one by Philip Carey about the history of Christian theology, which is another huge lecture, so I think that'll be fun too.
Yeah, today I did have some time earlier, and I was looking at I was just trying to crack into parables of war,
Mm-hmm.
and I noticed that there's a lot of references and things. So I thought, okay, I put up that copy of
The
Apocrypha, James. There's also
that's from
quotes.
Nag Hammadi, right?
Right.
Yeah.
There's also alternate quotes, like the New English Bible has for Ezra, or as it's called, to Esdras in that translation. Right. So a lot of points that he was making about translations, about parables in the very first part of the introduction, like the New American Bible does not translate it the same way, so I thought I'd include the verses as it was, in New American Bible, just as a contrast to see, what it looks like from a different perspective, just to keep us on our toes, I guess, don't want to accept anything, swallow whole things, like that.
Gotcha.
But unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to get much past that. I was working on, I was collecting the verses into a Word doc, and then I was going to export something else. Oh, the similitudes from that other book. What was he referencing? Enoch. And by similitudes meaning parables.
From Enoch?
Yeah. There's a section of 1 Enoch, I think it is, called the similitudes, and it's like several chapters all in a row. And that's what he's making reference to in the text in Parables of War, because similitudes can be translated as parable, and that was the first Greek word that he had referenced, and that took me a long time to find that actual word, because he had a different form. It's not used in the New Testament, so it's not in any of the NT lexicons. But parabola is, meaning parable or parabolic story. But the M part threw me off. Yeah, I was able to locate it online, and then that kind of put me in the right direction of exactly what I was looking at. But sometimes when you mix capital and lowercase Greek, sometimes I'm not, that kind of throws me off. I'm either used to all capitals or just the regular lowercase that you see usually. Sometimes the capital letters throw me off.
Yeah, I got Mounce's book on Biblical Greek on Jordan Day's recommendation. I mean, I'm not planning to learn Greek, but I want to get a little better so I can kind of recognize stuff here and there. But I basically really want to decipher stuff that's quoted in books, little passages or just individual words,
Yeah, the Septuagint Greek is like a whole different kind of species, because it's very much influenced by the Hebrew that it was translating. So New Testament Greek and Koine Greek from later periods is a little bit different, a little bit more influenced by cosmopolitanism.
Yeah.
Whereas Septuagint has an archaic flavor. It's almost like reading the King James, where the language used in the King James is already archaic and not much of use, to give it an aura of holiness about it by use of language, specific language, and you find a lot of that in the Septuagint, and it's also reflecting a lot of times the Greek, the Hebrew idiom. So
Hmm.
you wouldn't say certain things that way in Greek, but it's kind of trying to mimic the style of the underlying Hebrew.
Yeah. Oh, and I also got Bart Ehrman has those two books, How Jesus Became God and The Historical Jesus, or Did Jesus Exist? But
Right.
I got his teaching company lectures because they're supposedly, I've read that they're more in depth on both those topics. So he has a lecture called How Jesus Became God, and then he has a lecture called The Historical Jesus, and I got both of those too. So
Cool. I didn't know about that, but I do have both those books. It's interesting because when you read Did Jesus Exist, you can tell he's really not writing that book. He's writing How Jesus Became God. This is like a kind of a warm up for that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because he some of the things that he says when he's not specifically addressing mythicist topics is a lot of material that ended up in that later book, or as an expansion of it. So you might be reading Did Jesus exist in certain sections, and he's going on about arguments that he more develops further on. So I think that was one of the big problems I had with Did Jesus Exist, is that he really was. He should have paid more attention to what the book was supposed to be about,
Yeah.
rather than what he wanted to write. Really wanted to write about.
Now, do you know of if there's any great courses stuff on just like first century, roughly that time period, like Palestine and adjacent areas history?
Somebody in the Bible Geek listeners was like looking for stuff like that, say like podcasts and related stuff, and that's hard to find. Just history courses on the first century and that kind of stuff, because you just it's taught in seminaries. Scholars know it, but they've never seemed to feel it necessary to actually put it together in a way and present it to the layman so that they can get up to speed, I guess. So I haven't really been able to locate anything. If I really searched for it, I probably could eventually turn something up, but in a cursory search, I wasn't able to.
Well, I'm not saying go out and find me stuff, but if you ever run across anything that's good, let me know.
Yeah, I will, definitely.
Because I want to brush up on the general history of that time period. Then again, I mean, it seems like most of it pretty much comes from Josephus, so maybe I should just read Josephus.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's like, boy, it's a great tragedy of history that's all we have to rely on for that
Pretty
period.
much. I mean, he's the only voice really, I mean, that's really writing broadly in that time period. Oh, and I got one more on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Forgot about that one. That one wasn't as highly rated, but I just want to get a general overview, so I'm sure it'll be good for that. Wayne says, what? The Sea Scrolls died?
I want to get through other stuff first before Acts and Christian Beginnings, although that's on my list.
Is that a Teaching company lecture or a book?
That's the book from the Acts seminar, the
Oh
Apostles
yeah.
of Jesus seminar. Yeah, very interesting topic, and because I was reading Pervo's book on the
Dating
making of
Acts,
Acts,
right? Yeah.
and it would be a good follow-up, but there's so much other stuff I needed to get through first. It's not near the top of the list right now.
I think in the other order, I was reading Pervo's book, and I got a little overwhelmed with it, so I switched to reading the Acts and Christmas Beginnings because it was an easier read.
And someone told me, I think it was either you, Wayne, or John, said that the Jesus seminar relied heavily on Pervo's work. Anyway.
You mean the Acts seminar?
Yeah, sorry, Acts seminar.
Yeah,
Jim.
I was trying to find the passage from this book earlier to read to you, and I can't quite find where it says this in the right words. But they were saying that when they started the project, a lot of people in their seminar group were basically historicists regarding Acts, who actually did believe there was a lot of history in there. And part of their methodology would be kind of a little bit to vote, using their colored stones and stuff on what parts are historical and parts are not. But pretty much the entire group became convinced from Tyson and Pervo's arguments that it's almost all non-historical and second century. It's actually an amazing turnaround of their opinions for a lot of the group members.
Now, Pervo says it's second century, yeah, for sure, right?
Acts was long thought to be a first century document, and its author Luke to be a disciple of Paul, thus an eyewitness or acquaintance of eyewitnesses to nascent Christianity.
Yeah.
Acts was considered history pure and simple, but the Acts Seminar, a decade-long collaborative project by scholars affiliated with the Westar Institute, concluded that it dates from the 2nd century. That conclusion directly challenges the view of Acts as history and raises a host of new questions addressed in this final report. That's from the back cover.
Yeah. And I think, John, you told me that, or maybe it was you, Wayne, that they relied heavily on Pervo's work.
Right, and also I think we were talking also about Dennis R. MacDonald's Homer theory that played a big part. Yeah, Ronald, good old Ronald McDonald. Did Pervo ever serve time for that excursion into child pornography?
Surprised if he didn't.
Yeah, but you can't hold that against the scholarship, right?
Mm-mm.
I know some people would disagree with that, though. It's like throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. Yeah, I have, as far as the making of Acts goes, I'm just reading it as I'm scanning it, and I've only scanned up through chapter 5. But I thought it was kind of, it wasn't tough going, to me, because the chapters are shorter than a Dan Brown novel.
Yeah. I wish Daniel had left so early. I wanted to ask him a little more about his classification, neo-Tübingen. I wonder, if he accepts von Maunen's views on Pauline epistles or where he comes down on that. Sounds like he probably doesn't.
It depends, because the Tübingen school kind of mutated over. It went through a radical phase, and then everybody after von Maunen kind of went the opposite. Well, not the opposite, but kind of like went a little bit conservative. Yeah, so eventually it morphed into probably a little bit more conventional scholarship school.
I need to amend my earlier comment. I don't actually have Pervo's book here. I have Joseph B. Tyson's book.
Which one is that?
Marcion and Luke Acts, A Defining Struggle. So that's what I was comparing it to. I started reading the Marcion and Luke Acts, and I ended up switching to reading the Acts and Christian Beginnings first because I wanted to get more of the basics down.
Yeah, that first book you mentioned, that sounds interesting. The Marcion.
Yeah, it's one of the groundbreaking books in the subject. If you're studying the subject, you have to read this one by Tyson.
That's what, Tyson?
Tyson.
Oh, okay.
Joseph B. Tyson, Tyson.
I had a wireless keyboard and a wireless mouse, and my wireless mouse died, and I was using a regular USB mouse. Then today, my keyboard also died. Just stopped functioning completely, just mechanically, just stopped. So I went and got a new keyboard and mouse combo, and it's like I'm not used to it. It's just a slightly different feel to it. So I'm having trouble typing. I'm mistyping a lot of stuff, and the mouse settings are not quite right. It's going a little bit too fast for me, and I gotta tweak some of that stuff.
Yeah. Oh, is that the book there, Wayne?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Let me see how thick it is.
Not too bad.
No.
Dr. Price did a review on it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'll post the link here. He says it totally sucked.
Yeah, right.
Bibliography starts on page 167, so I'll give you an idea how long it is.
Oh, that's not long at all. Yeah, there he mentioned something about one of the views of the Tübingen school, so it might help us narrow in on what that means, because you really have to define what Tübingen means in order to be able to understand what neo-Tübingen still means.
Well, isn't Tübingen just basically that anyone coming out of the Dutch radical tradition?
Yeah, or at least from that geographical area.
Yeah.
Maybe it's like, it could be various things depending on who you're talking about or when, maybe.
But I heard even D.F. Strauss had some connection to Tübingen.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But he wasn't Dutch, I mean.
Man, there's a good article posted by Hermann Dettering, and it's in German. I wish this guy would actually just write in English.
All the time.
Yeah, because when I went to it, I had the option of translating it via the browser. And, it might as well be in German, because the translational software is just can't handle that kind, especially any kind of scholarly work that has a lot of jargon.
Oh, yeah, like soteriology and blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
But
like
from what I could figure out, it seemed really interesting, and I just, gosh darn it, I got to learn German. I really do. Heck with Hebrew and Greek.
It'd be easier than learning Greek because there's so much more in common. Greek has a whole other alphabet.
Well, yeah, if you sit around and listen to German being spoken, you can almost think like you can understand it.
Yeah.
It's one of those the illusion languages. When I went to Yugoslavia in the 70s, which is not Yugoslavia anymore, I was learning phrases from a phrase book, and then I thought, well, I should probably, since I'm going to travel there, I should learn it a little bit more, properly. So I started studying the grammar and stuff, and when I got there, I just thought I had understood everybody, even though there's no possible way I could have, but I could pick out certain grammatical structures, certain words, a lot of body language, gestures and stuff, and a lot of times I was kind of basically getting the general drift.
Now, are you sure they weren't speaking in tongues?
Well, those languages, those Slavic languages, I grew up in a place called Indiana Harbor, which is along Lake Michigan, where a lot of the steel mills and things were all congregated.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in a multi-ethnic area where you had, Croats, Serbians, Slovakians, Polish, Lithuanians, all those Baltic peoples, and there's a certain cadence to a lot of these languages, even if they're not speaking in it, if they're speaking English. So a lot of that rubs off where you can actually, with some assistance, you can kind of like you have an insight into it without actually understanding it.
Yeah.
I always find it weird when there's singers I like, and when they're singing, they sound perfectly normal, and then when they stop singing and they'll start like talking for like an interview, then you can hear like a really different accent that that's different to my ears. But it's like, how come I didn't notice that when you were singing?
That was the British invasion thing when they were pointing it out to, why do you sound American, Beatles, when you sing, but when you come here you have the Liverpudlian accent. And it's because they learn rock and roll from American exemplars. And that continued on for years and years. You can pick any band, even today, it's because of the American influence. I'm sorry, were you going to say something, James? I didn't mean to interrupt.
You said he had some questions on the Trinity, was that right?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this. I don't know if everyone here is a Trinitarian or not, but is there anything in the Bible that limits God's personhood to three persons, to God's being to three persons, or is it better to say that from the Trinitarian perspective, God is presented as having at least three persons in his being?
I think first off, we're not really a theology hangout, but if anybody has any comments about that, you're welcome to.
Well, I don't think there's anything explicit in the Bible, but I mean, unless you take 1 John 5:7 as authentic, then you could say there's at least three there, and that may be limiting too.
I know in the 2nd century, according to what we read in Justin Martyr, one common claim regarding certain groups of Christians being heretical was that they believed in two gods instead of one.
Yeah.
When they tried to make Jesus into God, which is interesting that they're not saying three instead of one. That hadn't really developed until later.
Yeah, I think that's a later Christology that's being read back into the text in a lot of ways.
Well, Marcion was ditheist or whatever, two gods. Some even believed there was 365.
So even holding that there's one God, there could be more persons in him than just the three that have been revealed so far?
Well, it depends on I think it would depend on if you accept 1 John 5:7 as authentic or not. I think if you do accept that, then that seems like it would be limiting it to three.
Okay.
Or if you're approaching it from a Christian theological standpoint, there's, in my view, a lot of views that could have been proto, quasi, non-Christian even, that were part of the formative process. So like Doug said, there are groups that had no conception of the Trinity. That would be something that they would find incomprehensible. Or groups that were Hellenized, very influenced by their culture, that would think it crazy to say there was only three.
Right.
And we could also be talking also about multiple Godheads rather than the traditional Christian Trinity.
If everything in the Bible is on the table in this discussion, then you have the remarks in Revelation about there being 7 spirits of God.
Good point. Okay. And then the final question is the term Son of God and Spirit of God, I guess, are used. Would it be inappropriate to say Father of God? If we were talking about the three persons in the Trinity, so that Jesus is the Son of God, the Holy Spirit is the Spirit of God, and then wouldn't it be then okay to say the Father is the Father of God? Would there be a problem with that?
I don't know. I always just thought of it as the Father, but the Father of God, I don't know.
It's almost like just a matter of semantics.
Yeah.
Would it be incorrect to say it though, from the Trinitarian perspective?
I don't know if it would be. I mean, they're all equal to each other essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Christian theology gets into a problem because of this. Um, when you're trying to talk about co-equal of the same substance beings, but then there's implications of subordination, Father the Son, and so forth. So it's been a real thorny philosophical problem for Christianity historically, I think.
Okay, and then just, are you all Trinitarians here?
I'm an atheist.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are actually believers here.
No.
Okay. Okay, awesome. All right,
But we're
thank you
we're not hostile, James.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't want to be hostile, but the like I was saying earlier in the chat, like John and Reuben kind of created this Hangout to be a companion to a particular podcast called the Bible Geek, and we kind of want it to be a place where we can discuss a critical approach to the Bible. So we take critical biblical mainstream scholarship for granted here. That's the only thing.
Okay. Okay, and on that point, what is the purpose of your interest, and this is to the whole group, of textual criticism of the Bible? Like, is it at being atheist or what have you? What is the interest?
Well, I was raised Christian, so I started, when I was young, being raised Catholic, I got interested in the Bible that I never got over.
Yeah, I was raised Christian. I was raised Pentecostal, and then when I was in college, I got into discussions with some people about Trinitarianism versus Unitarianism, and I kind of got converted over to Unitarianism for a while, but that was just a couple of years before I made my exit from religion entirely and realized that the Bible, in my mind, just doesn't agree with science, and I have to be intellectually honest, put science first. Plus, I think the Bible has lots of internal contradictions and other problems with pieces being edited so that they contradict what the prior thing had meant. So it's just a big can of worms. And then the whole thing just led me to not believing it anymore.
Yeah, I think a lot of us started out as believers, and we never, even though we lost our faith in a lot of cases, and some of us on the Bible Geek group haven't. I think there are a bunch of people who are still Christians on there.
Mm.
But I just never lost my interest in the Bible because I lost my faith. I still am super interested in the Bible, probably more so than ever.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Now that I feel like I have better tools for understanding it correctly, it seems more interesting to me. Back when I was a Christian, a lot of it was just mysterious. We don't understand this part, but God will eventually explain it to us what this problem is here. But critical scholars actually say, well, these problems actually are indicative of other things going on with the text that fit certain patterns. And you can study the entire patterns, and they're fascinating.
Do you all have the same interest with other religious texts, like, or is it just the Bible specifically, or?
Yes, for me, it's just the Bible specifically. I want to get into reading the Quran, but I just haven't gotten into reading it yet. I need to find a good introduction to read with it that I can kind of follow along with. I just haven't found something I want to use yet.
Yeah, me too. I want to get more interested in the Quran, but I also had a lot of exposure to Eastern religions when I was younger, so I have a interest in Hinduism, texts of the Bhagavad Gita, that kind of thing. But not as much as the Bible, because I'm familiar with it. I've got really great software for studying it, and it just.
And we're all culturally Christian. I mean.
Yeah, and we were all centered around Dr. Robert M. Price, who's the Bible Geek. That's where we get our name from. So, and since he's a double PhD New Testament scholar, that's kind of like the underlying unifying kind of thread here that keeps us all focused.
The atheist also?
Yes.
Okay.
Although he
Oh,
belongs to the Episcopalian Church, but I belong to the local Catholic Church too, but I don't consider myself a Catholic.
Yeah, and like I was saying earlier, like I'm not a believer anymore, but I was telling Daniel earlier, I still love Christian liturgy and love a lot of Christian sermons. Like they still have a big effect on me when I hear them.
Man, that's super interesting. Because you guys were talking about the Bible, I just assumed you were all like somewhat Christian or whatever it was. Okay.
Yeah, we get a
Cool.
lot of people that want to join
So,
the Facebook group who thinks that it's,
devotional, yeah, rather than
devotional, yeah. So they don't
Sorry
usually.
you jumped in the lion's den, James.
Oh, okay.
No, this is far from being a lion's den. I mean, there's other hangouts that I personally wouldn't even want to go into with atheists.
Mhm. I agree with that. Yeah, there's some atheists out there who are just they evangelize for atheism.
Yeah, I just don't buy that. Plus, the Bible is important. It's part of our culture. It's, it's the basis for a lot of things, and to me, religion is a humanism. It's something that's, of interest to humanity and mankind. So to me, it's interesting as well. Although I seem to take more of an anthropological approach to it rather than devotional.
Yeah, I'm struggling to understand the interest still, even with everything you guys have said. I'm like, but why these texts, and what is there to be gained from? Let's say you find errors or contradictions, maybe, or I don't know, like what would you do with that information, or I don't know.
Pure curiosity.
Yeah, it's just the residual interest in the text. I mean, like for say if someone was a Muslim or something and say they got converted to Christianity or became an atheist, they may still have a deep and abiding interest in Islam and Islamic scholarship and stuff like that. So
And of
there's
course, I'm trying to destroy Christianity personally and kill all Christians. So. That's my hidden agenda.
yeah.
Okay. Well, no, thank you for entertaining my questions. That's super interesting.
Oh yeah, you're always welcome.
Yeah, even if you just want to come in and listen or whatever you want to do, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
I was a physics major when I was in college. I didn't finish, but that was what I was studying. And every once in a while, I do kind of think along the lines you were suggesting that, this religion stuff doesn't actually have much practical application to me. Why don't I start going back to reading more physics stuff instead and read less of the biblical study stuff? But then I just run into a book that seems so fascinating on the subject, I get pulled back into it.
That's how I felt. Like, the Bible has so many mysteries in it, like its origins and all that stuff. I just think there's so much there that's fascinating. And because I used to, it was like a central document for me.
Yeah,
That still stayed with me, even though my belief in its authority has left me. Like, I still maintain the same interest in the book, just more from a historical perspective and learning about the history of the times that it developed through, all that stuff.
When I was really young, I was a dinosaur fanatic, in grade school. And then from that, I got into archaeology and then later on anthropology. And I think that those viewpoints and that scientific approach to culture is a major influence in my life from very young. So that's carried over throughout my entire life, even to this day, where I'm still interested in these things from the perspective of anthropology and so forth. And I'm also interested in other related cultures like Sumeria, Babylon, Ugarit, that kind of stuff.
That reminded me of a great example when James, you were saying you couldn't quite grasp why we're interested in it. I would liken it to people who have never had a belief in Egyptian religion. They're Egyptian scholars on Egyptian religion, and they're totally into it. They love it.
Right.
I'm talking ancient Egyptian, you know. And
Okay.
same type of approach, basically. You just for whatever reason have an interest in it, and that's good enough.
There's people who spend more time than we spend on this studying completely fictional worlds like Star Trek and Star Wars,
Yeah,
who know
you're
every little
right.
ship and dimensions of this, who know how to make models to the exact scale that they're used in the shows and movies and things.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah, well, there's always talk about doing a Bible Geek convention. You know, we're gonna have like action figures of Dr. Price,
Oh, please don't tell me that's true.
comic books.
Cool. Interesting. All right. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, definitely jump back into what you guys were getting into. But yeah, no, thank you for. Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Okay.
Yeah, because we're not all haters. You know, there are occasionally a hangout here and there where you know people can get along and discuss topics rather than constantly debating and you know whatever else. Because I've been in some of those hangouts and it's not pleasant.
And it would be sad if we didn't have scholars, still studying the old remnants, the human artistic products and things. The one question I might have in that guys, though, is whether there's too much emphasis on the Bible and too little on other ancient texts, or things like Plato's Republic and stuff. I mean, there's probably too many Bible scholars relative to how many Plato's Republic scholars we have. And it's not a fair balance for what we need for our modern society. But since religion has such a strong influence in our society, people who can counter what's happening in our culture are important also. So there's a role to be played. But I do think there's a lot of ancient stuff that has been neglected because we spend so much time studying religious texts, and we neglect a lot of other ancient texts that probably deserve more scholarship.
Yeah.
And that brings a more eclectic view to biblical scholarship when you take into a wider cultural milieu.
It's understandable, though, why there's such a skewed weighting of the number of scholars who are professionals on the Bible versus, say, the Republic or whatever. I mean, like Bart Ehrman always says, the Bible, and I agree with him, the Bible is like the most important book, period, end of story for Western civilization. So obviously it's going to get the lion's share of interest, It's shaped our culture on huge ways, maybe bigger than anything, other than maybe Alexander the Great, but even then, it's contender for sure.
So what do you think, James? Are we wasting our time?
Let me see, wasting? No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't say that. I think though, like Doug said, the Bible is very interesting, and maybe the mysteries and all those other things. But I think it's compelling. For me personally, I think it's compelling as far as, I don't know. Maybe I'm repeating what Doug said, but I think I don't want to make assumptions about what you guys are doing. But is there a part of you that wants to say that maybe it's true? You know what I mean? That's how I'm kind of looking at it, but I don't think you guys are doing that, but maybe there's something there,
I'm so far beyond thinking it maybe it's true. It's ridiculous. There's so many layers to reasons I believe it's false that it's just, there's no going back.
Yeah, I'm pretty much completely metaphysical naturalism as a worldview, to where it seems I cannot go back to how I thought, in my past.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to pile on, so go ahead.
Please do.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, I'm pretty much in the same boat. Like, so far, I mean, I'm open to anything. I probably agree with John. I would consider myself a metaphysical naturalist, but on the other hand, like Dr. Price always says, I can't pretend to know what goes on in the universe, so who knows what's going on out there ultimately, but
Yeah, it's more like just accepting the premise that a certain approach to um, thinking is the right way, not necessarily that you're arriving at the truth, but you're accepting certain starting points as being valid and moving on from there.
yeah. So metaphysical naturalism isn't a set of facts; it's a set of criteria for investigating the world.
Well put.
Yeah.
I do have my own views that are kind of far out on some subjects, opinions that aren't very popular.
Uh-oh.
One
Right
of
at
them,
the stake.
one of them that
Kidding.
I'll freely admit to here is I take David K. Lewis's philosophy of modal realism quite seriously. I think David K. Lewis was completely correct that all possible worlds necessarily exist. But most people think that's crazy.
Sounds crazy. It does sound crazy. But I haven't read him.
So that's like basically saying that every possible thing is basically exists simultaneously, and that whatever we consider reality is just hopping from dot to dot of possible.
Is one of those possibilities of a world where no possible worlds exist?
No. Possible worlds are at a level outside of what's in any actual world. So I don't really say that quite right, but it's the whole structure of possible worlds is its own unchangeable whole. I mean, it is how it is.
So it could only be inclusionary. You could never
Yeah.
have an exclusionary world.
That's where I guess where the monism comes in.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you could have a world where only one atom exists, right? Well,
Yes,
okay, I see
that's
what you're
completely
saying.
feasible. Yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Huh. Okay. You guys are. That's interesting, man. Like, because I want to believe that there's some inkling. There's a little bit left where you want, but you're saying that you don't have any interest in that idea. You've left that. You completely. It's out of your mind. So I have to take that and accept that. And I guess that makes it even more interesting as to why the interest is still there. But hey, man, that's cool. I actually find it super cool. But it's at the same time, it's like, how does that work? So,
Well, again, I think it's just it's like we're approaching it from an anthropological, historical perspective, in the same way that a modern scholar who has a PhD in Egyptian mythology, say, is interested in Egyptian mythology. Like they obviously don't believe any of that stuff, as far as they don't metaphysically accept any of it, but they're still really interested from an anthropological and historical perspective, and that I think we take a similar approach, even though it just so happens that we used to accept it as we used to have faith that these documents were authoritative.
that's what makes it more interesting for me. I don't think I'd be as intrigued if it was just somebody from India who, had only known Hinduism or whatever, or was still a Hindu and was a biblical textual critic or whatever scholar. Like, but I think being that you guys have completely left those ideas, the idea that you would still be interested in the skeleton of it all is interesting.
There's one guy, I forget his name. It's not Gaze of Ramesh, I don't think. Hold on. I'll find his name. He wrote a book about he was a ex-Muslim, and he's now like kind of an Islamic scholar. So obviously he's into the Quran and the Hadith and the history of the formation of the Quran and all that stuff. I mean, he loves it. But he's not a believer in Islam anymore. But that's his cultural identity, or a big part of it. So even though his faith in it is no longer there, it's still his culture. I mean, he grew up in that world, and for him it's still a dominating thing, so he's still majorly interested in it. Anyway, the book was something about how like some of the verses in the Quran were supposedly from the devil, satanic verses.
Yeah.
Book, yeah.
Demonic verses, yeah. Satanic, yeah.
Yeah, Salman Rushdie, yeah.
Yeah, he's on Bill Maher a lot.
Bill Maher?
Real time.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I can't stand Bill Maher.
Yeah, the Quran is not as intriguing. I mean, I'm not a scholar, but even if you try to read it, it's not organized or structured the way the Bible is, as far as chronologically or whatever.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
It jumps around. Yeah, it jumps around, and then it was obviously written by one person, and it's a much shorter time frame. 23 years or something that Muhammad recited to his friends who wrote it down or whatever. But I think.
Yeah, I don't think it's settled that it was written by one person. There's some.
Yeah, that's the
Orthodox scholars that strongly dispute that.
Yeah.
One suggestion is about a third of the Quran actually seems to be early Christian poetry that was adopted into Islam from a Gnostic-like Christian sect.
Possibly.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of the hymns that were just reworded.
Exactly, right. So I don't think there would be as much interest, like if you guys started going into that. I don't think you'd be as interested, other than just pointing out how many errors there are, I mean, I
think I would be interested. My problem is mainly linguistic. I don't have knowledge of those languages and have the good tools to work with it.
Our good friend Rob Beasley pointed out a website where it was written by a Muslim who sincerely thought that all 114 surahs were directly linked to the 114 sayings of Thomas's Gospel, quasi-Gnostic Gospel.
Oh yeah, what was his name, Ruben? That guy.
Yeah, I wouldn't remember it.
I can't remember.
Search the history.
But yeah, I think Islam is one more kind of offshoot. I don't mean that pejoratively, but one more offshoot of the Abrahamic tradition. A major offshoot, but I think Abrahamic religion, everything under that umbrella, to me is interesting. But yeah, I mean, I'm just personally more acquainted with Christianity primarily, and I'm getting more and more interested in Judaism, separate from Christianity. Traditional Jewish perspectives on the Hebrew Bible, how they interpret the texts, how they see the law, all that stuff, because I always came at it from a Christian perspective, and progressive revelation. The law is outdated now, and I've been attending these hangouts, Torah study hangouts, where I keep my mouth shut about critical aspects of the Hebrew scriptures, because that's not the purpose of this hangout. This hangout is for devotional Torah study. So, I don't bring up critical stuff because they don't, that's not their purpose for this hangout, so I leave it out. But I love going because I get to hear the Jewish perspective on their documents, So
yeah,
it is related to Christianity in a huge way, obviously, but it's also different in a lot of important ways. So in that way, I think I've kind of branched out a little bit just from focusing just on the New Testament, But yeah, I haven't gotten into Islam as much, but I would like to eventually. And even Eastern religions, I would like to get into Buddhism and Hinduism, and I've just gotten a little bit my feet wet into Babylonian religion, Sumerian, that sort of stuff. But yeah, mainly just because of cultural identification. I'm just still interested in the Bible because that's what I grew up with, and I know it the best.
And you all have degrees. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
You go ahead.
Just really quick, you all have degrees in this, in textual criticism, or?
I don't. I have no degrees.
No, none of us do. We're just amateurs who are interested in it.
Okay.
Yeah. Apparently, we spend way too much time.
Regarding
Daniel, who was in here earlier, just wrote his master's thesis for New Testament, though. So he actually has some formal education, but he left, I think, right before you came in.
Okay.
Yeah, I think regarding the foundations of Islam, and like I said, my knowledge of this just comes in bits and pieces from hearing other people talk about it, and comments on the internet and things. I've never done any thorough study. But what it looks like to me is just a lot like an earlier version of the Protestant Reformation. They're both doing about the same thing. They're both reactions against Catholicism, trying to recover an earlier faith, from the mess that Catholicism made. And they're just that happening in different social contexts and cultures and time periods. But I think they're just both trying to go back and reconstruct a better religion than what the Catholic Church has gave on to them.
Sola Scriptura.
You know who doesn't hold back is Wayman when he's in those Torah study groups.
No, he doesn't. But he always prefaces his what is that word? Prefaces? I don't know. He always has a preface for his comments saying he gives a disclaimer. This is a critical blah blah blah. Yeah. But I just leave that shit out because especially when James was hosting, he didn't have any patience for it. Not you, James. There's another James who used to host the Hangout. He didn't have any patience for it, and you could just see him getting angry. So I just cut it out. Uh-oh, John probably disconnected.
That makes it even more interesting that you guys don't have degrees in that. What do you guys have, or what are your fields of study like as far as school goes?
I just have a high school degree and a little bit of college. I never finished. Just basically zero professional formal education in the topic.
Myself, I went to community college for like a year and a half and then transferred to university without getting a 2-year degree and studied there for a year and a half, but my study skills were not that good and I ended up dropping out. So I have over 2 years worth of credits. I never got the right combination of classes to get an actual degree. Just because I was missing some GURs.
Okay. So what do you guys do now, like as far as occupation?
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was a machinist for like 10 years before it took me that long to realize I wasn't that good at it. And right now I do mostly computer stuff and just odds and ends, computer maintenance and some programming in a few languages and some database work and some web page work for some couple different people.
Yeah, I'm just a mail carrier, a city letter carrier.
Okay.
Mailman.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes it even, like I said, it makes it even more interesting that it's not something that you have to be doing right now for some degree. Like, you guys are just that interested. That's cool, man. That's super cool to me.
Yeah. Yeah, we are. I mean, we all are really interested in the topic. I mean, we have the Facebook group, which I think is over like a couple thousand people now, and most of them...
Around 1,600.
Okay. Yeah, most of them don't have any formal education. Obviously, Dr. Price has 2 PhDs. He has a PhD in theology and New Testament, but that he's the exception. I mean, most of us are just interested on an amateur level. So.
Cool.
But yeah, we do this every week on Tuesday, so feel free anytime you want to drop by. And sometimes Dr. Price joins us, and feel free to ask any questions, and he's totally open to you know, coming at it from a devotional perspective. So don't shy away from that.
I'd probably do a lot more listening though. I mean, because like I said, I'm just already. You guys are in this weird way saying things in the way that I think I would say them, or even the way you guys were just talking about the mess that Catholicism made, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
but yeah, if I ever had questions, I'd jump in.
Okay, cool. I was listening to James White's podcast today, and he was commenting on this interview. I forget the two guys' names, but one was a Protestant, one was a Catholic, and man, it was entertaining. You guys should listen to that. I mean, the Protestant guy just slaughtered the Catholic guy, just slaughtered him. It was a pretty bad beat for sure. I mean, at one point the Protestant guy's like listing some problems he had with the Catholic Church, and they were talking about the history of the church. So of course he brings up the Inquisition, and the Catholic guy's like, "Well, what's wrong with the Inquisition?" And the other guy's like, "Well, what do you think about the Albigensian Crusades and the Cathars and all that?" And he's all, "Oh, it just got really bad. Like, you guys have to listen to it. It got really bad."
There's an ancient book I have. I got it from my mother-in-law's house. It was up in the attic, and it belonged to my wife's grandfather, and he was a school teacher. But he's got all these books from the 1800s that were really into naturalism and rationalism. So I figured he was kind of like a free thinker, although probably not too many people knew about it. So I'm reading, this book. It's called The History of the Inquisition, and it's like that thick. And I'm going through this, and then there's like a third of it is the Protestant Inquisition. The persecution, the martyrdoms of Protestants by other Protestants. It's available on archive.org, I think.
Yeah, I'll get you that link, James. Reuben actually got me hooked on James White. He's a Calvinist, but he's a really good, I think, Christian apologist. Obviously, I don't agree with him, but he is a very effective debater. And
yeah, I'm familiar with him. Dr. Oakley's 1689, I think his YouTube name is.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, Dr. Oakley's something.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah, Calvinist.
Do you have iTunes, by the way?
I don't have iTunes.
Okay, well, I'll get you a link to this somehow.
You can actually link directly to some iTunes stuff without even having the software installed.
Did I say Catholic, Reuben? Did I say James White was a Catholic?
You typed it.
Oh, I did, yeah, sorry. Too much wine, I guess. Yeah, he's a Calvinist, not a Catholic.
I actually just watched a debate he had last week. Well, he had it a while ago, but I watched it last week about the Trinity and whatever. But anyway, yeah, continue.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I watched a bunch of his debates. He's a really good debater. There was one on him and I think it was a Jehovah's Witness on divinization, which was really good too.
I'd like to see a good debate on predestination between Catholics and Calvinists.
Yeah, I would love to see a good James White debate on predestination.
He's done that with Dr. Michael Brown.
Really?
Well, I guess it's Arminianism versus Calvinism.
But it comes up.
Yeah, I think I saw that one.
Yeah.
Okay, I found it. I'll add it to my to-watch list there. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Because Catholics do have a doctrine of predestination that's not generally known, but it's definitely not Calvinistic.
No. James, are you a Calvinist, or what's your denomination, or how would you classify yourself?
Yeah, no, I couldn't be a Calvinist. But no, I don't have a
You're the
denomination.
Jamesian.
I'm a Jamesian.
That works.
Yeah, no, I don't believe the Trinity as written as Trinitarians believe it. I do believe Jesus is the Son of God. I believe he's divine. I believe he came from God's being himself, meaning that he's God's son, as the Bible says.
Mhm.
He had no earthly father, so God is his father. And he's in subordination to the Father, so
Oh, interesting.
yeah, they're not equal. It's repeated too much throughout the Bible. But yeah, so I accept his divinity in that sense. And what else? Okay, Calvinism, predestination. I believe we have free will. We make all our decisions. I don't believe God knows the future. I believe the future is
Really?
not something that, yeah, I don't think the future is something that can be known. It doesn't exist yet, but I do believe God knows all that can be known. Um, so when he declares the future, that's prophecy, and he can bring it to pass. And um, what else can I say? Like when Jesus tells Peter that he'll deny him 3 times before the rooster crows, I don't think that from eternity past that is something that would have happened if Jesus would not have told them that was going to happen. Like that would have just been too much of a coincidence. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yep.
Because that night Peter was telling him how much he loved him more than everybody else. I don't think if Jesus wouldn't have told him that he would have still ended up denying him 3 times. I think
Yeah. He's like, even if I have to die, I won't deny you. And then, sure enough.
exactly. So I think he declared that, it became a truth, and then it took place. So I think he can declare the future, or God can declare the future, and I think Jesus had that power while he was on earth as well. Um, but I don't know whatever that means. I am that's what I am.
Reuben says you're partly open theist, partly Arianism, partly semi-Arianism, and he wants to know what your opinion on original sin is.
Yeah, I don't believe how people normally understand that is what it truly is. We are innately sinful in the sense that we will sin because we are in this flesh. So that
So you're
means,
Pelagian?
is that what it is?
Yeah, that's Pelagianism. Where
Okay.
you're not born automatically with the stain of original sin, but because humans have just a sinful nature and they live in of an environment of sin, so they're going to sin no matter what.
Exactly. So God's not going to send somebody to hell automatically because they are in flesh. Otherwise, Jesus would have been a sinful person. Like he would have been a sinner at birth himself, because he
Well,
was
you
in
know
flesh.
that's why the Catholics came up with the Immaculate Conception.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank
Which
you,
is,
Ruben.
but that's yeah. So to me, that's like weird. It's like, come on, man, don't. That's a weird cop out. But
Yeah, I agree.
yeah. So that's my view on that.
Wow, you're really an interesting combination of things, I gotta say.
Were you influenced at all by the Watchtower in your background?
No, never.
Oh, okay.
Why do you ask that?
Just some of the things that Ruben was characterizing as Arian now is just because sometimes some of the theology I've heard from witnesses has been in that vein. Do you consider that Jesus was like pre-existent or always existent, or was he a created being?
So he's okay. So I believe he came from God's being himself because God says he's his son. That's why I say that. So if in the sense that God is eternal, and if Jesus was part of God somehow from eternity past, in that sense, if somebody wants to say that Jesus was eternal, then sure, because he was part of God, being that he's his son. But he came forth from God at some point. Um, so he has a beginning in that sense. You know what I mean? But I believe that's before the world, whenever that happened, before the world came into being. But that still makes him God's son. That still makes him pre-existent to the earth. But he's not eternally past of his own being, such that there would be two people eternally that existed. Yeah, I don't think. I think only God eternally existed himself. The Father, that would be.
Gotcha. Well, I gotta say, I've never run into a combination of different doctrinal stances.
Is that different doctrinal stances?
Yeah, I've never run into your particular combination. Yeah,
Yeah, I
you're a
just can't.
Pelagian, so automatically a lot of Christians would consider you heretical. You're open theist, so James White wouldn't be a fan of you.
Yeah.
But
Mm-hmm.
This is what they warned about.
I'm not bagging on you. I'm actually really liking what you're saying. I think you have a good approach, unique approach, but a really good one.
Yeah. No, I haven't considered my own church. I don't have. That's the question out there in the text there. But I've considered teaching the Bible at times, but I don't think I would force my views on people. I would just help them understand what the text itself says as good as I could possibly do it. And then so a lot of these things are actually peripheral and they're not salvation issues. So, like, if somebody believes in the Trinity, the way people present it, if they believe in original sin, that way, okay. I mean, I'm not gonna actually fight you for too long on that. Because it's not a salvation issue in my mind. Somebody else might say, well, if you don't understand who God is really because you don't believe Jesus is God, then you can't be saved or whatever. I don't I don't see it that way.
Yeah. So what's your view on soteriology? Like, what are the mechanics of salvation absent the stain of original sin, that inherited stain? What's the atonement for?
So I mean, yeah, God has given death is the only payment for sin, and in the sacrificial system, an animal had to die for some of certain sins, or the person had to die for certain sins. It wasn't about anything else other than believing that action of killing that animal or killing that person handled that thing with sin. So in the same sense, Jesus is now the sacrifice that has been made, so that whoever believes that Jesus died for their sins has their sins paid for. So I don't see many steps before or after that are involved in salvation. It's literally accepting the process. Would it be the process for forgiveness? Whatever that's called. This what would be the term for that? The system for forgiveness, I guess you would say, that God has given us, and that's believing that Jesus died for your sins.
Soteriology.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the necessity of Jesus' sacrifice, given that there was already a system in place laid out by God for the forgiveness of ritual uncleanness?
There was no necessity. There was no necessity. God killed everybody with the flood himself the first time, right? Like, if he wanted to keep doing that, killing people for their own sins, he would have kept doing that. He decided to. Why God chose to do that, I can't say. It just seems like, it seems when we got to that second phase of sacrificial system and animals dying instead of God killing, or humans being allowed to kill another person for adultery or murder, he's now saying, okay, I'm not going to kill you guys moving forward. You guys now have the authority to work out the killing for sin. Why I don't know why. And then when he gives his son, obviously, as in Hebrews, as it says, and I don't know who wrote Hebrews, but the priest had to do this over and over and over again for people, and year after year and whatever. But Jesus, who was a human, not an animal, was able to die one time, and now anybody who accepts his death for their sin is forgiven. So I don't know, I guess he just wanted to make it easier for people or condense it, or I don't know. I don't know.
That makes sense. It's a progressive revelation that would fit just fine into that.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your approach, James.
Thank you. Say that again, Felix.
I wish more Christians were like you.
Thank you. Reading.
I probably would agree with that.
Animal sacrifice is the least of the forms of atonement. It only covers unintentional sins. A murderer cannot be forgiven through sacrifice, but Jesus died on Passover, not Yom Kippur. His death does not cover sins. He is not an atoning sacrifice.
That's Reuben. That was all Reuben.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah,
He's in disguise.
He's in, yeah. Yeah, but there was always death for whatever sin, no? All right, well, I'll ponder those things. I've heard them, but I don't want to take the time to respond at the moment.
Anyway, that podcast, I meant to get that to you. Actually, I wish I had my iPod here handy.
Well, the one thing I'll say about the murderer cannot be forgiven through sacrifice. That's if the murderer has to be killed. So death is still the payment for this sin. That's what it's just that for other sins, the death of the animal was acceptable. But yeah, in the case of murder or adultery or whatever it is, apparently God felt death of the person is the only acceptable payment. Cain was not killed. That's a good point. Cain was not killed. I have to go take a look back at that. I'm trying to think. I don't know if that God did not state do not kill yet. I know he didn't even with the flood. I don't know what the sins were that the people were committing when he made the flood go down. But maybe it's because he hadn't given that information to Cain not to do it. But I guess he was still punished somewhat. But yes, you're right. He didn't die. Cain didn't die.
Even the animals are bad.
Even the animals are bad. Yeah. Is that said in the Bible that the flood generation was doing cannibalism, human sacrifice, and stuff? Wasn't it that they were? It just says that their minds was focused on sin continually, as far as Genesis 6.
And violence.
Oh, in the oral Torah. Okay. Well, I can't speak on that. So do you guys look into the oral Torah as well in your studies?
Yeah, I do, and it drives me crazy.
Why is that?
The more I read it, the less it's like, to me, they understand it just about as less as everybody else.
Wow.
You know, I don't think sometimes that there's any special insight from the rabbinic oral Torah. I really don't.
That's how I feel, but I don't have the study to say that. So that's interesting that you say that way.
I know. I could just shoot my mouth off.
Interesting.
Look, Reuben just wrote about cannibalism, human sacrifice, mass murder, slavery.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's a traditional interpretation that these guys came up with. That's completely outside the text. The text doesn't say any of that.
Right.
You know? So to me, it's like, how much more valid is it than say what a fundamentalist preacher might get out of the same text?
Right. And I don't know why God would need that commentary or that extra information. Like, I never understood extra texts. Like, why? For what? If it's not in the Bible, you probably don't need to know it. But circumcision, for example, like, yeah, you probably are going to need to know what circumcision is because the Bible doesn't clearly define that. So you might need oral tradition. But I don't know. I just find a lot of it to be superfluous information.
I can understand why it developed in that, but I just think that a lot of it is sometimes is completely irrelevant. You know, it's based on traditions from cultural. I was going to say milieu again, from cultural backgrounds and things that you know, formed apart from the people that wrote these texts. It's almost like they were. There's a disconnect in some way, in a lot of senses, so that they're a distance from the thinking of the people that wrote these Hebrew scriptures in the same way that we're distant from people of the first century. That yes, there's scholarly opinions about what people were talking about and what this stuff means, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were right. You know, it's still speculative.
Right.
That's the way I look at it. But I don't, you know, to me, because I'm approaching it from a different perspective as you are, James. You know, I'm just, you know, I'm looking at it from a cultural perspective. So to me, it's not superfluous. It just most of the time it just seems to be missing the mark.
So, okay, and I guess when Doug gets back, he can respond also. When you guys do the studies, is it that you read the actual texts and then look at commentaries or other historical documents, or do you think you are more about the documents surrounding the actual text themselves? Like, have you like literally read the Bible that way, or read the oral Torah that way? Like,
Doug actually participates in those hangouts. I just listen like on YouTube while I'm doing something else usually. So I don't contribute to that, but I'm interested in the opinions of the people that do participate. And a lot of times I totally disagree because I think Wayne was mentioning earlier that he's approaching things from like a higher critical position of the Torah, where we're looking at it from you know, source criticism and form criticism and those types of approaches, and these guys are looking at it from a devotional. In some cases, are also just learning it on its own terms. In other words, they're not bringing any outside analysis into it. They're looking at the text, what it says, what rabbinic commentary has been on it, and that sort of stuff. So to me, it's interesting to hear those points of view, but I think I disagree with a lot of it. But I don't participate in those hangouts. I know Doug does, though.
Okay.
I just listen.
Doug. Oh no, for Doug, for the question was, do you actually end up in your studies like reading the texts that you're interested in, or is it more supplementary information or commentaries that you look to?
No, I read the source texts too. I mean, I definitely need to read more of the Old Testament, specifically the historical books and some of the prophets, but yeah, I mean, I try and read all that stuff, yeah. I've read all the Gospels a bunch of times, and I've read almost all the epistles at least once, a lot of them a couple times, but I need to do more of it for sure. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. No, I don't want to limit it just to commentary on the text. I actually want to read the source text too.
Well, Reuben brings up in the chat the notion that the Torah, or even if you look at the entire Tanakh, not everything is laid out. So it's kind of necessary to interpret certain things, and some of these interpretations have become part of the oral tradition. And but to me, it's like when they're working but when they're working this stuff out, they're looking at a document that's ancient even to them. They're working out how to apply it within the culture that they're living in, the time and the place, and so forth. So what they come up with in their expansions, their explanations, their interpretations are not exactly, and I wouldn't say they were like genetically in many cases related to the ideas of the people that produced the texts themselves. They had different responses to things that weren't spelled out, that were lost and were reinterpreted and recreated in a different setting later on by a different group of in some sense the same people, but maybe in a lot of cases even different people.
Hmm. Okay.
And I think one example that I can think of is the idea of Lilith, Adam's first wife. You know, to me, those are folk tales that were taken seriously by the rabbinic commentators, trying to work out certain aspects that they found confusing in Genesis. But to me, that idea was completely foreign to the people that were writing the text initially. You know, so to me, to bring in that idea of Adam's first wife named Lilith and a relationship to Eve and so forth is to me irrelevant, because it really does not come from the same cultural product, thing that produced it. So I don't really think it's relevant even to bring it up. It's interesting, but it's not relevant. I don't think it doesn't really shed any light on what's really going on.
Right.
Now, some people might disagree, like Dr. Price might disagree, because he places like these legends, Lilith legends, from other Near Eastern cultures. So they're getting the idea of Lulutu, I think it was, is a pronunciation from Canaanite mythology, the night hag, and that it's relevant in that way. But I don't have any opinion on that particular interpretation. Oh.
Do you guys take the position?
My Logos Bible software is downloading, which means it's probably gonna kick me off. Because when that software installs new resources, it indexes it, and I can't do anything on my computer.
Do you guys take the position that the Bible, the New Testament, is taking from like Horus and Mithra and other mythical legends or whatever, as far as the parts of the Jesus story?
There's some influence. I'm not exactly sure exactly how that all worked. I don't think it would sprang out of that kind of stuff. I think it might have even been later on influenced by it, but there are some links.
I think a lot of the broad themes of some of the Hellenistic mythologies were floating in the air at the time. Mm-hmm. It was in the culture. I mean, Palestine at the time was a Roman territory essentially, and Jews and people in that area were exposed to all these Hellenistic ideas, and I think it inevitably seeped into the formation of Christianity, and even seeped into Judaism. And I don't necessarily think there are one-to-one direct parallels on most of this stuff. The stuff in Zeitgeist where Mithras was born on December 25th, I think that's all bullshit. There's no historical data to back it up. But like the stuff with the virgin birth, I think that comes from a Hellenistic tradition in general of like demigods having miraculous births or being accompanied by astrological signs like we have in Matthew with the star. I think there's some general influence, some thematic influence, but I don't think there's any specific, total adoption of one specific myth in Christianity. I just think it was floating in the air. It was part of the zeitgeist at the time, and I think it inevitably got incorporated unconsciously into the tradition of Christianity.
Yeah, I think for me it almost appears that people after the fact, after they saw the Jesus story, they began to label parts of the story the way they do in, like, let's say Zeitgeist or whatever it was, like the way you just said virgin birth or whatever. Like, I don't think anybody would ever have labeled it a virgin birth or I'm sorry, miraculous birth. I don't think anybody would label it that way until the Jesus story. Like, you didn't people weren't making those correlations between other mythologies and saying, okay, all these things have miraculous births in them, and then Jesus comes along and he's just another miraculous birth. I think Jesus, the story of Jesus is written down. People classify it as a miraculous virgin birth, and then they go back and say, well, this guy was born because the mother made a wooden phallus and had sex with it, and look, it's a miraculous birth, the way Jesus was a miraculous birth. I don't know. I think it's after the fact. It's a label that's placed on Jesus and then tried to be applied back to other things. They weren't being related to each other that way before him, I don't think.
Ruben says, I do think there was great influence on the early Christianities from the mystery religions and certain pagan groups. I take the view that Christianity originates in Alexandria, Egypt. There, the early Christian movement was heavily influenced by mystery religions, pagan and Jewish Gnosticism, possibly also Philo of Alexandria. As the movement moved into Syria, they started to view Jesus as a human being, not as a deity, and as we know, the Proto-Orthodox won out in the end, accepting a Jewish tecton origin for Jesus and also his divinity.
Ooh. But would you accept that people weren't relating the other mythologies that we're talking about in as far as parts of their stories the way they do after Jesus comes out?
I think there was some of that, but I think a lot of it predated Christianity. Like even Irenaeus, I think, says that, you know, all these pagan mystery religions and pagan mythologies, the reason they, in a lot of ways, seem so much like Christianity is because Satan prefigured what was going to happen and planted seeds in the pagan world to throw off the scent of believers, basically. So even the it was Justin Martyr, sorry, yeah.
But that's after Jesus. That's what I'm saying.
Justin Martyr recognized it after the fact, but these traditions were around long before.
It's a tacit admission,
written, or even Paul's epistles were written.
It's a tacit admission that they were known to be earlier because you had to explain them away because
right.
of that.
And he said it was Satan influencing them before the fact, because Satan knew that Jesus was going to come eventually, and so he put these what would you call them, previews, bastardized previews of Jesus into these pagan traditions.
I think again, and another reason is because those stories were just stories, maybe hieroglyphics or whatever, but they weren't like writings the way we have one story of, or one book of Matthew, one book of John, or whatever. Like this is literally, there's probably 4 versions of the Mithra or the Horus that just were around, and there was never, you couldn't go find a writing of it. It's just a passed down story from somewhere. Or maybe hieroglyphics etched somewhere, and like there could be hundreds of different versions of it wherever you found it etched or whatever. But yeah, I think it's easier because the story of Jesus was written down in 4 different places to then analyze it element for element and then go back, because with the other ones they're so fluid and ambiguous or vague or changing, and you can just pick a version of the story that has an element that you can apply back to Jesus. I don't know. That's how I look at it. But I hear what you're saying, and I guess I'd want to look at the way you said Irenaeus. What was his name? Irenaeus.
Irenaeus.
It was Justin Martyr who.
Justin Martyr.
Yeah, read what Justin Martyr wrote about some of the pagan traditions that preceded Christianity. Just read what he wrote about it and what he thought. You know, because he gave reasons why he thought some of these pagan mythologies that, in his opinion, predated Christianity, and he said, well, it was because Satan was trying to throw people off the scent, basically. Anyway, I gotta go, guys. James, it was great talking to you. Everybody else, I gotta go to bed. I gotta go to work tomorrow. So anyway, it was really fun, and I'll see you guys. I'll see some of you on Sunday, and the rest of you next week.
Have a good one.
All right, take care.
Well, good night.
I will look at Justin Martyr. Mhm. Sorry to, I didn't want to hijack the chat. You're not wedded to your position. Okay. I'm not acquainted with either of those. Yeah, I don't know any of those references or names. No, I do not. I do not know as plan. You guys are out of here?
No, I was talking to my son. Woke up.
Oh.
Yeah, he couldn't sleep. So I give him a glass of warm milk and put him to bed.
Okay.
Yeah, he's 15. But yeah, it's getting late because I got to get up early to get them ready for school. So I was thinking, go ahead and give him saying goodnight myself.
I'm gonna watch the thing he recommended for me from James White. But no, this is cool, man. I'm fully interested in how you guys are approaching this. This is intriguing.
Yeah, I had more to say on what you were talking about with the Gospels being written as opposed to the pagan stories. But I'm getting so tired I don't think I could say it coherently right now. So good night, all. I appreciate you guys stopping by. I see we're still alive, though. So all this is being recorded to YouTube, and you can always stop by for future reference. Wayne, did you get everything you wanted in?
I got the quote from Justin Martyr on my screen share now.
Okay. Oh, good.
Okay.
Yeah, I can refer back to that. Okay, I remember that. You know, it depends on which translation you read, but I noticed that some translations make it sound like he's not saying what Doug was talking about, you know. So I think a lot of it has to do with what English translation you're reading. I've read some translations where it doesn't seem like a slam dunk that Justin Martyr is saying that, you know, we believe in the same way that you believe in the gods, we believe in Jesus. You know, you consider them myths, and we consider taking that to mean that we believe Jesus is a myth as well. So, you know, to me, it's a debatable point, but I'd like to look into that more when I'm not as tired.
I'll see you guys later next time.
All right, thanks, James, for stopping by. Really
And good night, all.
appreciate it. Good night, Wayne. Good night, Reuven.